Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my first proper video, in which I shall discuss Operation Pedestal, the operation that saved the Maltese Islands in the Greater War effort 80 years ago, and during August of 1942, and concluded on this very day, on the 15th August 1942. So what shall I cover in today's video? I shall cover the background of the operation, the reason why it happened, British and Axis assets in not too great detail, that will be left for a future video. Day-by-day action, in which I shall describe in relatively simple terms, of course, since this is concise, what went on day by day, and the strategic implications of the operation, uh, meaning what was the outcome of the operation and what effect did it have on the tactical and strategic level of the Second World War. I shall not cover convoys prior to or after Pedestal, submarine supply runs to Malta, other operations which occurred at the same time as Pedestal, these being, uh, just to name a few, Operation Bellows, Operation Berserk, and Operation Ascendant. Air operations out of Malta during Pedestal, the Axis perspective of Pedestal, and Axis naval and air operations against the convoy. All of these will require further in-depth research, including some digging in archives to get a proper picture of what actually went on. Note that, as I said, this is a concise history, not an exhaustive, in-depth examination of all engagements and actions. This shall be a project that I shall leave to the future, in which I will do in-depth analyses of every single day, hour by hour, what went on, um, and what the outcomes were for that. That is for the future. So, due to this being concise, certain details have been left out or simplified, meaning that these details represented in this video may not be fully representative of the historical events being discussed. It doesn't mean that what is being presented is incorrect, but what it means is that it may not give a full picture of what actually went on. This operation is highly complex, uh, especially when viewed from both sides. So that is one thing we need to take into account from the start. The background to this operation. So Malta was a key location in the Mediterranean, guarding and controlling the major sea lanes. These sea lanes uh, effectively connected a large majority of the world's shipping, as they still do today, that travels through the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, Malta has always been a very strategic location since the dawn of civilization, essentially, from the Phoenicians to the British over thousands and thousands of years. All major sea powers have wished to control Malta so that they can control the surrounding waters. So whoever controlled the island could essentially control a majority of the trade that went on in the Mediterranean. And this was uh, made even more strategically important in the Second World War, in which Malta could uh, essentially uh, attack convoys from uh, Italy to North Africa that were resupplying the war in North Africa, as well as raiding entirely naval outposts and ships, etc., that were coming out of Italy, essentially being a thorn in the side of the Axis. The island had been used for a number of offensive operations in the past, and had increasingly hampered Axis operations in North Africa as time went on. Now, this was made worse by the fact that the supply situation, especially in Rommel's army, was uh, sort of balancing on a tightrope. It was a very precarious situation for him, and it's the reason why he had to retreat a number of times when he was on the offensive, because he just ran out of fuel, essentially, or overstretched his supply lines. Uh, the war in North Africa is a very interesting story that needs a full in-depth analysis. It is highly misunderstood. highly misrepresented. But essentially, the fact that Rommel especially was working on a tightrope in terms of his supplies and logistics was compounded by the fact that a lot of them were getting sunk by aircraft and submarines based out of Malta. However, uh, the Axis had effectively dominated the sea and air over Malta during the middle part of 1942 because Malta was running out of food, fuel, and ammunition, which are the three key um, factors to any uh, offensive operations as well as defensive operations. And the situation was becoming quite precarious for the Maltese. Uh, it was it was estimated that Malta would have run out of food by roughly the end of summer, beginning of autumn, somewhere in that time period. And although this was staved off by fast minesweepers and submarines bringing in fresh supplies of uh, mainly armament and fuel for to keep the defense operations going, but this could not last forever, and the convoy was desperately needed. As you can see, the Maltese had been bombed uh, in the top right corner uh, constantly for years at this point. So it is you can sort of guess the situation. Not only were they being bombed constantly, but it got to the point where there was very little that Allied fighters could do to stop them at this period in time. They could mount certain operations, but it's the fact that they were limited by lack of fuel, and they were also running out of food. So you can already imagine the situation that the island was being put in. And the British High Command recognized the situation because they viewed Malta as a stronghold, and losing the stronghold was it was understood that it would almost completely jeopardize any operations out of North Africa or Arabia. So the British assets had, now as I said, I'm not going to list all of them for the sake of simplicity. That will be done in a more uh, in-depth analysis, but the, keep these in mind as time goes along during this video. British had 3 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 light cruisers, on which you could see HMS Manchester in the top right corner, which was one of the light cruisers, 32 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 11 submarines, 7 motor launches, 14 merchant ships, 2 fleet oilers being fleet replenishment ships for fuel, 74 fighters, and 28 torpedo bombers, as well as RAF aircraft based out of Malta. The number I couldn't find an exact number because figures vary hugely, and you can't with numbers, especially with aircraft. There's always going to be a certain limit to how much you can estimate because of number of aircraft that have been made unserviceable or that will be cannibalized for parts. You can't really get a clear picture, but these were the British assets. As you can see, they committed quite a large amount of ships, but especially manpower, to this operation, which sort of highlights how important Malta was viewed by the British High Command. So the Axis assets, we see that they have 3 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, 23 motor torpedo boats, 21 submarines, and 285 bombers, as well as 304 fighters. This was basically the bulk of all of their assets, especially with aircraft, in the region, which underpinned how important they viewed stopping this convoy was. Of interest in the photos to the right, the top one in the top right corner, you see 2 aircraft. The one which is taking off is an SM-79 torpedo bomber, which you can just see the torpedo, if you look closely enough, taking off for operations against the convoy. Below it, you see the I-2001 fighter also preparing for operations. These 2 types were sort of the spearhead of operations against the convoy, and this specific photo, as I'm talking about, is quite rare because you don't really see this uh, in any media source, but this is a photo taken prior to an Italian operation against the convoy. So this is quite rare stuff indeed. You can't really find much of this. Below, you find the submarine Axum, which was used against the the convoy, as well as the submarine being made infamous for torpedoing Ohio. If you saw the photo at the front, that was the one of his torpedoes going off, making a big bang. So the basic plan was relatively simple. The Royal Navy would escort the convoy of merchant ships from Gibraltar to the Grand Harbour. The battleship escort would make its way back to Gibraltar and the convoy would reach a certain point in order to minimize their exposure to air attack. The British had learned uh, the hard way on why you shouldn't risk your capital ships being put against air attack uh, when they lost two of them to Japanese air attack in the Pacific with a lot of sailors drowning. The convoy would then run the gauntlet of Axis air and sea attacks, while at the same time a decoy convoy would set out from the east in Alexandria in order to draw away enemy assets. So the 9th and 10th of August, there's quite little action going on actually. The convoy is still starting up and it's still far away from any of the major um, Italian and German air bases. And the convoy passes through the Strait of Gibraltar since it actually started out in Britain but made its way down towards Gibraltar where it would enter the Mediterranean. And that's where it met its escort. A number of aircraft spotted the convoy and reported their position. It was believed that the convoy was not seen from enemy shores, however it was reported by intercepts from Bletchley Park that Abwehr agents had spotted the convoy uh, and reported its position, with the convoy being alerted that it had been spotted. Flieger Corps 10 was also ordered to reconnoiter the area in order to uh, make sure to keep position of the convoy if it noticed them and keep its position. Uh, by now the convoy on the 11th of August was moving in a zigzag pattern in order to preempt any attacks from the air or from the sea for that matter as well. HMS Furious was conducting the flying off of its Spitfires which headed to Malta and returned to Gibraltar, a small typo over there, along with its escorts. This was part of Operation Bellows, which would be covered in a different video. But this was one of the famous club runs in which an aircraft carrier would go towards within range of Malta, fly off some Spitfires, and head back to Gibraltar. The convoy was spotted later on in the day by U-73, which was a German submarine, which engaged and sank HMS Eagle, with 929 survivors being picked up by HMS Lookout, HMS Lefaurie, and the tug Jaunty. Now this was quite catastrophic because that basically reduced the convoy's air cover by a third, and this was only the very beginning of the operation. So the submarine evaded destruction due to different water temperatures depending on the layer, which affected the ASDIC's detection capability. Now, ASDIC is basically sonar, and to put it very simply, and what happened was that because of the way the sound behaves with different layers of water, if a submarine is able to go in between the interaction between those layers and go where the layers meet, it will be able to evade it, which is quite interesting. I'd like to eventually make a video about it, but that's once I've read into the technical aspects of the subject. Later on in the day, Luftwaffe aircraft, mainly Ju-88s and H-111s, engaged the convoy, with at least 2 aircraft being shot down, although there was no damage done to the convoy. The 12th of August is where things started to really heat up. The convoy became the prime focus of the Axis, with Hermann Göring stating that Flieger Corps 2 and 10 will operate with no other thought in mind than the destruction of the British convoy. The destruction of this convoy is of decisive importance. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica would deliver multiple raids with 200 strike aircraft and 100 fighters, dwarfing the 24 fighters meant to defend the convoy. This is roughly, uh, they basically threw everything that they could at this convoy. A number of enemy submarines were also engaged. Brin and Emo were driven off, Cobalto was depth-charged, rammed and sunk by HMS Ithuriel, and Granito was forced dive by HMS Pathfinder. Axum manages to hit the Ohio as well on this operation. HMS Indomitable was hit quite badly, I must say. It sent a hole. There was a big hole put to the flight deck, which essentially put it out of action. HMS Cairo was badly damaged and was scuttled, and Foresight was crippled and eventually was scuttled some time later. The damage done to Domitable, as I said, was significant enough for it to prevent the launch and recovery of further aircraft, which reduced the overall fighter coverage to just HMS Victorious, which accommodated any remaining aircraft, and aircraft which couldn't be stored were just dumped over the side. This was just as things began to heat up as well. A number of merchant ships were also sunk, and later on, as the day went on, as the 12th eventually became the 13th, 4th Z, which was the bulk of the heavy fleet, battleships, as well as HMS Indomitable, was ordered to turn back towards Gibraltar, along with other damaged vessels which couldn't keep going. On the 13th of August, the convoy comes under attack from German E-boats and Italian mass boats. This was all during the night, so there was significant action in the dark, during which Wairangi, Almeria Likes, Santa Elisa, and Glenorchy were all sunk. So quite a large proportion of the merchant ship fleet. Remember, I said 14 set out. That's already about 5 of them. Not to mention all the others which had been sunk in the previous day's action. So quite a lot of the merchant shipping fleet was already sunk. This was followed by Waimarama, which was completely obliterated later on during the day, in which essentially it was during an air raid, and the ship was bombed and it exploded with such a furious explosion that the following aircraft that was bombing it was actually thrown out of the sky by the force of the explosion and was destroyed. The ship was completely obliterated, and the sea around it was set on fire by the aviation fuel. And that's basically what you're seeing over there. That's the oil slick on the front, uh, catching fire. And into that sailed HMS Ledbury, which picked up 27 survivors. So quite an act of bravery. The first ships on this day began arriving in the Grand Harbour in the afternoon, though the action by the mass boats earlier on in the day had split up the convoy, and not only that, but some ships were damaged, they were lagging behind, especially Ohio. Others were taking different routes to avoid other defenses. So by this point, it was just complete mayhem. But it was working out. The first ships managed to enter. On the 14th, Brisbane Star, which was one of the remaining merchant ships, entered the Grand Harbour with Spitfires circling overhead. On the following day was one of the most famous operations of the entire Mediterranean campaign, one of the most famous photos which you can see on the right, was when Ohio limped into port on the 15th, having been under tow for some days, having lost all power, and when I say limped into port, it barely even managed to get in. The hull was basically buckling in the middle, and the ship was taking on quite a bit of water. So when it was almost miraculous as it got inside, I would even say borderline miraculous. It was reported that crowds cheered and the band played Rule Britannia. As the ship came further into view, the band fell silent as a bugle sounded still, and men removed their hats and women made the sign of the cross. But what mattered was that Ohio had managed to get in with the vital aviation fuel that essentially saved Maltese Island. And this this is basically this moment is when the operation entered into legend almost. It was when it was immortalized. This photo basically encapsulates the entire operation. It also encapsulates the defiance of Malta, as well as the spirit of the operation and of the Maltese people alongside defenders who came from all over the Commonwealth. It's quite a momentous achievement that they managed to do that. The most important thing was that, as I said, they got the fuel that Malta desperately needed off of the off of the Ohio just as it settled on the bottom of the harbor by Fort Ricastle. So operational losses. On one side you have British losses where they uh, lost one aircraft carrier, two light cruisers, one destroyer, nine merchant ships, one aircraft carrier damaged, two light cruisers damaged, three merchant ships damaged, 34 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 350 to 550 casualties. The Axis lost two submarines, one heavy cruiser damaged, one light cruiser damaged, one submarine damaged, 48 to 60 aircraft destroyed, and around 100 casualties. Although, as I noted, further examination of these numbers is definitely required. But the operational outcome is what matters the most. The operation is deemed a success. Axis forces were unable to prevent the resupply of Malta, which would have dire consequences for them in the long run. I've noticed that there is some debate over whether the operation was a tactical success due to heavy British losses, but in my opinion, this argument is nullified due to the strategic implications of the whole operation, which are which meant that which outweighed any tactical uh, losses because the strategic implications not just outweighed them, but it would sway which way the war went in Africa as well as eventually the war in Italy. So we see the strategic implications presented here. Malta was resupplied and back in the fight. This meant that not only was Malta able just to defend itself again, meaning it would make life difficult for the Axis bombers who were constantly raiding the islands, it would mean that it would drain those bombers from other operations and as well as throwing them into a meat grinder of sorts where they'd be able to where they'd basically be not just drawn away from other operations but destroyed as well. But this is just looking at the defensive aspect. The offensive aspect is equally, if not more important, because it meant that the British and Commonwealth forces outside that are based out of Malta could now take the fight to the Axis, and this is highly significant because it meant that Rommel was losing, Rommel in particular, was losing a lot of his supplies. The overall situation in North Africa became ever more precarious. It also meant that convoys would have to be rerouted further and further away from Malta, which would mean that supplies took longer to arrive, which is also part of the success of Pedestal in the long run. Morale was significantly boosted, both especially on the island, but also uh, abroad elsewhere as well since success of this operation. Um, the defense was strengthened, uh, as meaning that Axis operations against Malta were reduced, and since that meant that their effectiveness was reduced, it meant that offensive operations were being used to greater effect as well. Now, basically, that meant that as any operations in North Africa were beginning to uh, lose their overall momentum and eventually get beaten back, as we see in the Second Battle of El Alamein. Uh, as I said, this creates a big stranglehold on any supplies to North Africa, which was, as I've said already, um, was already in a very precarious situation when it came to supplies. But one thing which isn't as discussed, I've noticed, is that this operation would help to secure Malta as a launching point for future offensives in Sicily and Italy, which would come further on down the line in about mid-1943. Since Malta was not only be able to be used as a refueling base for fighters, but also as an offensive base from which Tigers could be struck. So that's basically it, guys. What are your thoughts? Please let me know. If you're interested, there's the sources for all the images and for the information in here down in the description below, which will become a recurring theme as I make more of these videos. Uh, Please leave a like and subscribe, and thank you for your time, and hope to see you soon.